Jason tried to stay calm, but there was something deeper going on there. Something he still couldn't fully understand. What seemed like a simple opportunity was about to turn into an obstacle even bigger than he imagined. As Jason tried to stay composed during the interview, the feeling of veiled discrimination lingered. He knew that the rejection he was facing wasn't just about his qualifications, but something more intimate, more painful. As someone who had grown up in an environment full of prejudices, he knew that this disguised discrimination could be a greater obstacle than anything else. After the interview, he received a rejection email which, by itself, was not surprising. However, the email came with a final line that made Jason's stomach churn. Unfortunately, we believe the ideal candidate for the position offers more in terms of fitting into our environment. It was a clear euphemism for what was happening. His identity was unwelcome. It was the refusal of who he was in such a subtle and insidious way that left him speechless. The following day was an emotional struggle for Jason. He couldn't focus on anything. The pain of rejection was back, now accompanied by a deep sense of hopelessness. He sat in silence, staring at the walls of Liam's house, wondering how, despite all his effort, he still couldn't escape the pain of being who he was. He felt like there was no way out. The battle between being himself and the demands of a world that rejected him was becoming harder to win. And as if that wasn't enough, his friendship with Liam was also starting to be affected. Liam, although always understanding, didn't have all the answers. Sometimes Jason felt like his friend no longer knew how to help him. He was starting to feel alone again. But Jason wasn't completely defeated. Something inside him, a small spark of hope, had not yet gone out. The struggle to find a place in the world was about to transform into something bigger. He didn't know it, but a change was on its way. He just needed to believe in something bigger than himself. After the disappointment with the job, rejection, and the growing sense of failure, Jason found a small ray of light. On a dark night, while walking alone through the city, he was approached by an unexpected person. It was a woman in her 30s with a warm smile and a kind gaze. Sarah, as she introduced herself, said she was working on an event project aimed at supporting LGBT people facing difficulties like his. She explained that the event would provide a safe space for those facing the same kind of rejection and isolation. The offer seemed almost like a miracle for Jason, as if he had been guided there. He felt compelled to accept. After all, if he could meet others like him, maybe things would get easier. It was exactly the kind of support he felt he needed. Without thinking twice, he accepted the offer, hoping he could finally find a place where he felt accepted, where his true identity was not only tolerated but celebrated. The event was a large gathering at a community center, with lectures, shared life stories, and a series of activities for people who had been marginalized by society. Upon arrival, Jason was welcomed by a positive and inviting atmosphere. He felt immediate relief seeing friendly faces and hearing stories of overcoming struggles that resonated deeply with his own experience. It was the first time in months he felt he was not alone. There, he met other people going through the same struggles, and he felt a little more connected seeing how united the group was. One of the most memorable moments of the night was when he heard the testimony of a woman named Eva, who had gone through a similar journey to his own, being rejected by her family and circle of friends. Eva said that despite everything, she had found true love, and most importantly, had found herself. She spoke about opening her eyes to the power of self-acceptance, of being truly authentic, and not allowing others to define her life. Jason not only felt moved, but also felt something inside him shifting. He knew that, although his journey was difficult, that night represented a very important step in the right direction. He was learning to free himself from the pain he had been carrying, accepting who he was without shame or fear. But, despite the feeling of relief and belonging he was experiencing at that moment, something inside Jason still wasn't complete. He knew that this small victory was only the beginning, and a new challenge was approaching quickly, one harder and more intense than he could have ever imagined. **** In the days that followed the event, Jason was more excited than ever. He felt that he had finally found a place where he could be himself without fear. The support he received at the community event gave him the strength to begin seeing his future differently. He was ready to take new steps and embrace his identity without apologies. He began to open up more with Liam, and for the first time they talked about his childhood and the pain of being rejected by his family. Jason realized how he had always carried a silent guilt for something that should never have been his fault. The fact that he was gay. Finally, it seemed like he was freeing himself from a burden that had followed him for years. In the same week, he received a job offer at a local cafe. It was a small step, but significant. He had a new job, a new perspective, and perhaps more importantly, a new confidence in who he was. The feeling of victory was undeniable. He shared the news with Liam, and they both celebrated the achievement. Liam, who had always been his biggest support, seemed genuinely happy for him. Jason, looking back at all that he had overcome, felt a sense of relief. He felt as though he had finally found a new beginning. The weight of rejection was starting to fade, and he was ready to take the next steps. But as the days passed, a strange feeling began to settle in Jason. Something wasn't right. The change in his life seemed positive, but the internal loneliness still remained. He thought he had finally won, but the reality was far from perfect. When he arrived at work, the atmosphere at the cafe was welcoming. But he quickly realized that while everyone seemed polite, there was something strange about the interactions. The looks he received were more than just curious. There was judgment in their words. Something between welcome and you don't belong here. He felt uncomfortable. Jason realized that the acceptance he thought he had found at work wasn't genuine. Instead, he was being treated with distant politeness, a type of tolerance that didn't turn into real inclusion. The false sense of victory made him see that even though things seemed better, he was still dealing with subtle discrimination and the fear of being rejected for who he truly was. The sense of victory dissipated in the face of cruel reality. What he thought was a solution was just the surface of a much larger battle. Jason had not yet won. Something else was ahead, and it would be even more challenging than anything he had faced before. Jason was sinking into an emotional spiral. The false sense of victory had vanished, and now he felt as though he was back at square one. The loneliness was overwhelming, and he felt that the people around him didn't see him for who he truly was. The work environment was worsening each day. Although his coworkers were polite, Jason felt the distance between him and the rest of the team grow with every moment. One particularly difficult night, as Jason walked the streets, feeling more lost than ever, he was approached by someone unexpected. It was his older brother Michael, whom he hadn't seen in years. Jason never imagined he would see him again, and the pain of their separation was still very present. Michael, with a concerned look, invited him for coffee, and reluctantly, Jason accepted. As they sat down at the cafe, the conversation quickly turned to the reason for their rift. Jason had never told Michael about his sexual orientation. In fact, he had distanced himself from the whole family out of fear of their reaction. However, as they talked, he realized that Michael was trying to reconnect, perhaps awkwardly, but still trying to understand who he truly was. Jason tried to open up, but as he started talking about his identity, the old pain and fears began to take over him again. It was then that Michael revealed something Jason never imagined hearing. "I know who you are, Jason. I always knew." These words, which should have been a relief, had the opposite effect. Jason was paralyzed. How did Michael know? And what did he mean by that? Michael then confessed that he had seen signs that Jason was distancing himself. And though he had never said anything before, he had always known Jason was hiding something. However, what truly devastated Jason in that moment was Michael's confession about the family. Michael explained that, after their separation, their parents had a hard time accepting the fact that Jason was gay. They had felt ashamed and blamed Michael for not preventing the rift. Jason had known about the subtle homophobia that permeated his house, but hearing it from his brother was an emotional bombshell. He realized that, in reality, the lack of support from his family was a reflection of the pain and hatred that society had for people like him. This revelation not only shattered the image Jason had of his own family, but also cast doubt on everything he believed to be true about himself. In a single moment, rejection transformed into something even deeper. But Jason didn't know that a choice was about to arise, a choice that would change his life forever. A story begins with Jason, an 18-year-old young man sitting on a park bench, staring at the horizon, lost in his thoughts. He is alone, but the feeling of loneliness presses on his heart like a constant weight. The scene around him is calm. with the soft sound of the wind rustling the trees and the distant chirping of birds, but his mind is at war. The past week has been the hardest of his entire life. He still can't believe things have gotten to this point. Jason had always known that one day he would have to face the truth about who he really was. Since he was a child, his conservative family had never given him the space to be different, to be who he felt he should be. He grew up in a small town where anything outside of the norm was considered shameful. He knew he was gay from a very young age, but he always kept it hidden, trying to fit in, fearing rejection and judgment. However, one day, the internal pressure became so great that he could no longer hide it. During a family dinner, he finally opened up to his parents, revealing what he had known to be true. But instead of understanding, what he received was a reaction he could never have imagined: pure and cruel rejection. "You're no longer welcome here," his parents said, looking at him with cold eyes, devoid of any sign of compassion. Jason was kicked out of his house, and everything he knew, everything he loved, was ripped away from him in a brutal, merciless way. There was no more shelter, no more family. The house that was supposed to be a home turned into a place of pain, a space where he was no longer accepted, where he could no longer be who he was. The loneliness was overwhelming. The streets of the town, once familiar, now felt threatening. He had nowhere to go. He had nowhere to return. But as Jason walked the streets aimlessly, something unexpected happened. A familiar voice called out to him. It was Liam, a longtime friend who knew about Jason's internal struggle, but never imagined things would get to this point. Liam was there, at the right moment, when everything seemed lost. What Jason didn't know at that moment was that his life was about to change forever. A single act of love and courage would completely alter his path. He didn't know that a simple act of kindness from someone who truly cared would be the key to his transformation. After being kicked out, Jason found himself completely lost. It wasn't just the lack of a physical home, but the loss of everything he had believed was safe. Family, friends, his identity in the world, everything had been taken from him in a single act of rejection. He had been stripped of his old life and found himself in a reality where his identity was no longer welcome. Jason knew the road ahead would be difficult, but with Liam's support, he felt there was a chance to rebuild his life. Liam, who had been Jason's childhood friend, offered him a place to stay. He knew what Jason was going through, as he had always known that Jason was different, but had never dared to talk about it. Liam, with all his love and empathy, not only welcomed him into his home but gave him the space to be who he was. But reality was relentless. In his new environment, Jason began facing new challenges. Loneliness continued to be a constant, but now, more than that, he found himself confronted with much deeper issues. Even living with Liam, Jason was not at peace with himself. Each day was a struggle to find his new place in the world. Now that he had been stripped of his old life, Jason searched for work, but it wasn't easy. He found himself in interviews where, in each answer, there was a shadow of doubt and discomfort about who he was. In many of these conversations, he felt he had to hide his true identity in order to be accepted and have a fair chance. And with each new rejection, he felt a greater weight inside him. As if his life were a lie he was trying to conceal from society. Liam, noticing Jason's suffering, tried to support him as much as possible, but even he didn't know what to do. They spent hours talking, but there were no easy answers. It was as if Jason was trapped in an invisible prison, where acceptance and freedom seemed out of reach. And then, something happened that changed everything, an unexpected event that brought more pain and conflict. One night, after a long day of failed attempts, Jason encountered a group of old acquaintances on the street. Among them was Tyler, a guy he had been involved with in the past before everything went wrong. Tyler, who had always been rude and judgmental, greeted him coldly, making it clear that he was no longer welcome in their lives. Tyler was direct and cruel. "You have to understand there's no place for you here." He looked at Jason with a mixture of contempt and superiority. This wasn't just an emotional punch, but also a painful reminder of how the world still wasn't ready to accept someone like him. In that moment, Jason felt the pain of rejection once again. He stood there, not knowing what to do. Liam was at home, but Jason knew he needed to handle this on his own. He felt that Tyler's words confirmed his worst fears. There was no easy future for someone like him, no matter how hard he tried to adjust or please others. What seemed like a simple rejection was becoming something much deeper and more devastating. But Jason wasn't alone on this journey. Something within him sparked in that moment of pain. He knew he couldn't let this define his life. His journey was just beginning, and he would soon discover that true strength didn't come from hiding who he was, but from embracing his true identity. After the bitter experience with Tyler, Jason felt defeated but also determined not to let the pain of rejection be the end of his story. He knew he needed to find a way forward, even if it meant challenging all odds. Liam's support gave him strength to continue. But he knew that, as much as his friend was a rock, Jason needed to find his own inner strength to change the course of his life. It was at this moment of internal solitude that Jason made a decision. He would start over. The cycle of fear and shame needed to end, and he could no longer live in the shadow of what others thought of him. He decided to look for a job in a new place, a different city where no one knew him, where he could start anew, free from the stares and judgments. Jason's first attempt was to pick himself up and search for work in a neighboring city, where he felt more anonymous. He applied for several jobs, many of them in areas he had never worked before, like clothing stores and cafes. The idea was to take a first step, even if small, to start feeling useful again, and perhaps find a way to rebuild his self-esteem. At first, things seemed promising. He was called for a few interviews. The first few weeks were a tide of hope. Every interview, every "thank you for coming" or "we are considering your application" was a small victory. For Jason, it seemed that everything was finally starting to work out. But at the same time, he was aware that he wasn't fully prepared for the emotional complexities his new life would require. However, what seemed to be a solution to his problems quickly turned into another challenge. During one of these interviews, Jason was questioned about his past. He tried to be vague, but the recrimination in the interviewer's eyes was clear. Something about him wasn't right. It wasn't just the judgmental look, but the way the situation made him feel inferior and rejected again. He didn't know how to deal with it. The fear of being discovered, of having his true identity exposed, was like a ticking time bomb ready to explode. He began to wonder if he was really ready for this kind of life. The hours of anguish and reflection began to dominate his days. Jason realized he was still not completely healed from the pain of rejection. He felt that, no matter how much he tried to hide, his identity was still something he didn't know how to deal with. No matter how hard he tried to move forward, the fear of being judged seemed to follow him like a constant shadow. But Jason wouldn't let pain be the end. He was about to discover that a real solution wasn't found in hiding who he was, but in facing this fear head-on. And it was when he least expected it that he found the key to true transformation. Double quotes. Jason was starting to feel that he had found some kind of stability. Even though it wasn't easy, he was managing the challenges that arose along his path. But as life often teaches, not everything is as it seems. Monday began like any other, with Jason going to yet another interview at a clothing store. He already knew the competition would be fierce, but he was determined to try. Liam, always by his side, believed things were finally starting to get better. Jason felt a little stronger and was feeling optimistic. The view of the future seemed less dark, but as he entered the store, something immediately made him feel a deep discomfort. The environment, although modern and pleasant, was filled with judgments. As he was led to the interview, he noticed the way people looked at him. Something was wrong, and he knew it. The moment the interview began, the atmosphere became tense. The interviewer, an older man with a rigid appearance, seemed to look at him in a discomforting way. Jason felt as if every word he spoke was being meticulously analyzed. "Do you have enough experience?" the interviewer asked, his voice cold and distant. Nervously, Jason tried to give the best possible answer. But then the question he feared came. "Have you worked in places like this before? How do you handle change?" The way the question was asked, with a fixed and investigative gaze, made Jason realize that the interviewer knew something he wasn't saying. The truth was, Jason didn't have experience, but he knew that wasn't what was at stake here. He was being evaluated for his identity, not his competence. After the devastating conversation with his brother Michael, Jason felt more lost than ever. He felt that, despite all his efforts to free himself from his pain and find a new life, the rejection from his own family was a weight he could not bear. The emotional pressure was crushing him, and the cafe where he worked no longer seemed like the safe place he once thought it was. One night, As he sat at home reflecting on everything that had happened, Jason received an unexpected message. It was from Liam, his best friend and confidant. Liam had been trying to contact him for days, but Jason, in his emotional state, had avoided his calls. The message from Liam was simple but filled with care and concern. Jason, I know you're going through a tough time. I want you to know you're not alone. Let's talk, I'm here for you. Jason felt the weight of sadness momentarily lift when he saw the message. Liam had always been the loyal friend and the support he needed, even in the hardest times. And it was then, in that vulnerable moment, that Jason made the decision that would change his life. When he called Liam, Jason was more vulnerable than ever. He opened his heart, sharing the fears, the pain, and the rejection he felt, not just from his family, but from everything he had believed to be true about his identity. Liam, always with his calm and empathetic voice, said something Jason never imagined hearing. Jason, you have something amazing inside of you, something that isn't defined by what others think. You are worthy of love, happiness, and being exactly who you are. You don't have to carry that weight alone anymore. These words were like a shock to Jason's reality. He knew that, despite the pain and rejection, true change didn't come from external acceptance, but from the acceptance he finally needed to have for himself. Liam wasn't just offering support. He was giving Jason the power to choose his happiness. However, as everything in his life seemed complicated, Jason also knew that he needed to face his family if he wanted closure. He knew that, no matter how painful it was, he had to confront the demons of his past, even if it was the last step he had to take. But he wasn't alone anymore. Liam was with him, and that gave him the strength he needed to keep fighting for his life. But the decision to face his family wouldn't be as simple as he imagined. Jason would soon realize that this choice would place him face to face with a painful confrontation, and the fight for his emotional freedom would be harder than he ever thought. Jason knew the moment he had feared had arrived. He had decided to face his family, and there was no turning back. He had dragged himself for years, trying to adapt to what others expected of him. But he finally understood that the price of denying who he truly was much higher than any rejection he might face. What he didn't know was how emotionally devastating this confrontation would be. Jason had distanced himself from his family, but the love was still there, perhaps overshadowed by pain, but not destroyed. He had prepared himself mentally, but the uncertainty of how they would react made him nervous. The weight of what he was about to say seemed unbearable. However, something changed when he sat down at the kitchen table of his parents' house, where they were visibly tense but not aggressive. The atmosphere was heavy, as if everyone knew something important was about to happen. Jason felt his heart pounding, but now, instead of running from the conversation, he felt ready to finally be who he had always been. He looked into his mother's eyes, who still carried a trace of sadness for everything that had happened, and began to speak. I'm gay, and I don't want to hide it anymore. I'm tired of living in fear of what you think of me, he said, his voice trembling but firm. As he spoke these words, Jason realized that it wasn't about being accepted by his parents, but about accepting himself, and with that, gaining the emotional freedom he had always sought. The initial reaction from his mother was a mix of tears and silence. His father, more emotionally closed off, didn't say anything immediately. The silence was deafening, but Jason didn't look back. He knew that by taking this step, he was reclaiming his power. It was the most vulnerable moment of his life, but also the moment of his greatest transformation. The silence that followed was long, but Jason stayed there, waiting. No longer anxious, but hopeful. After a few minutes, it was his father who finally spoke. He said in a calm tone, but filled with emotion, I didn't know this, son. I don't completely understand, but I love you. I just want you to be happy. If this is what makes you happy, then I'll try to understand. Jason felt free for the first time in his life. He knew there was still much to resolve, but that small step, that simple acceptance of his identity, was an overwhelming victory. But the real victory was still to come. Jason's journey was far from over, and he would soon discover that, even when things seemed to improve, new battles arise when you least expect them. After the difficult confrontation with his family, Jason felt a sense of relief he never imagined experiencing. The fear that had accompanied him for years finally began to dissipate. Although he knew there was more work to be done to heal the wounds of the past, the simple fact of opening up and being honest with his parents was the beginning of a profound transformation. Over time, the relationship between Jason and his family began to change. Though it wasn't instantaneous, there was a genuine effort on their part to understand and support him. Initially, there was resistance, especially from his father, who still struggled to fully accept Jason's identity. But gradually, they began to talk more openly about the issues that underlay the rejection and prejudice. Liam, who had always been by Jason's side, now saw the change his friend had achieved. Liam's support was crucial, and together, they began to rebuild a fuller and happier life, now free from the shackles of fear and shame. Every day, Jason felt freer and more complete. The cafe where Jason worked also reflected this internal change. In the beginning, he felt the distance from his coworkers, but over time, he was able to establish more genuine relationships, free from any pretense. The employees started to see him for who he truly was, and at a community event at the cafe, he was invited to share his story. At that moment, in front of an attentive audience, Jason finally realized the impact his journey of self-discovery had not only on his own life, but on those who were listening. Jason looked toward the future with more confidence. He knew that, although obstacles wouldn't disappear overnight, he was now equipped with the emotional tools to face them. The pain of the past slowly transformed into a source of strength, and the fear of being who he truly was had finally disappeared. The greatest lesson Jason learned was that true acceptance starts from within. His family's reaction and the interactions he had with people around him were important, but it was his acceptance of himself that truly changed his life. He freed himself from an emotional prison, and by doing so found true love not in another human being, but within himself. Jason was no longer defined by the rejection he had suffered, but by the strength he gained from overcoming the pain. He knew that this was his true freedom, the ability to live authentically, without fear of being who he truly was. As Jason looked toward the future, he knew that true love wasn't in a perfect relationship, but in genuine, authentic relationships, where truth and acceptance are the strongest foundations. He was finally free, and there was nothing more powerful than that. Life has the power to surprise us in ways we could never imagine. Sometimes we face our greatest fears to discover that true freedom is in accepting who we are. If you've ever felt lost or afraid to show yourself to the world, remember, the most important love is the love you have for yourself. And that, indeed, can change your life forever.